It's been 20 years since the Soviet Union collapsed. They were socialists. They proudly called themselves socialists.
Yeah.
In those 20 years, we've had a whole generation grow up, and they haven't learned what real communism, socialism, collectivism is.
Yeah, the Red Scare hasn't been around for a couple of decades.
And a lot of people who used to be socialists have now morphed into other ideologies. For example, environmentalists. Environmentalists, through whether it's global warming regulation or something else, also want to control the economy. They want to regulate everything. I call them watermelons. They're green on the outside, but what they really are is red on the inside.
The earth that is being terrorized for its resources cannot be fixed by these companies or their monies.
Skies are turning brown, and the skies are falling. And we are now suffocating in our own waste.
This culture has become a cancer on the planet.
The outdated economic systems that have been harming the planet. These same systems are responsible for most instances of poverty in recent history.
We must loosen our grip on old ways of producing energy, doing business, and gathering wealth.
Fossil fuel industry ruling New Mexico, wielding often unchecked power over the present and future of the state.
We live in a culture whose core values seem to be greed, consumption, and exploitation.
So, in remembering the beingness of the dinosaurs, of the fossil fuels that we are extracting from the earth in that process, having these carbon emissions coming now in extracting oil and gas and things that are buried, is that we are living off the dead. We're reaching into the past that is not complete for us to take again. That we are accelerating time, and that's why we have these climate crises that are happening.
Facts are our friends.
Our children and grandchildren will live in a carbon-constrained future, or they will not have a future.
Climate change is prompting us for systems change.
A scientific-based cap on emissions is only the starting point in a long and arduous climb out of a hole we've dug for ourselves. It will be hard.
I wanted to talk about the history of environmentalism in New Mexico.
I think the environmental movement in many ways can trace its origin from the Gila, and both from the standpoint of the significance of the Gila as the original wilderness and the wilderness system, as well as individuals who played out that part. Aldo Leopold was on the Gila at least in 1922. Of course, Aldo Leopold went on to become the father of game management, and although not necessarily enshrined with the concept of father of the American conservation movement, he certainly became that. And also with that, the extension of that, we could say he, in many ways, epitomized the foundation of the wilderness system itself. His experience in Arizona and New Mexico, as well as his writings about Gavilon in Mexico, formed the basis and some of the foundational concepts of the conservation movement and the modern conservation movement.
So if he's considered the father of the movement, what do you think? What was his contribution with that? I mean, was it just the idea of management? Was it the idea of he didn't come up with the Frankenstein concept yet that the Earth was polluted and it's going right to hell? We're all going to burn like Carson did.
Leopold's basic thought process incorporated the idea of stewardship heavily into the idea that he had that there should always be wild places set aside. And in his writings, he talks about a portion of lands always set aside. And I think that there were even references to a certain percentage of land set aside. I can't find where he suggested that should be done legislatively. Rather, he did that on the basis that he thought good stewardship and the implementation of set-aside lands should come from the steward and from those that are close to the land. I think that as soon as the wilderness system was established, and that was a regional a Forest Service regional office administrative move that set aside the Gila wilderness. That was not a congressional act. The history of the Gila, even in the 40s, would suggest that the environmental movement was finding roots. When Peter Shelley was notified in 1942 of the termination of his permit, which was largely what is now the Gila Wilderness Corps, already the basis of a modern environmental movement could be sorted out or distinguished when Supervisor Lessel, in a simple letter without any prior discussion or any indication that it would happen, sent a letter to the Shelley family simply saying your permit is canceled. You were gone. At that time, they were still trying to recover from the Depression, didn't have the economic means to battle it, nor did they have the inclination or the expectation that they could prevail. But it certainly changed the history of the family and the direction of ranching in general in the Gila, starting in the 40s.
Now, are you related to the Shelleys?
I am related to the Shelleys. Peter Shelley was my great-great-grandfather. There are a number of us, and certainly I think his legacy touches a lot of us, but there are very few of us left in the business of livestock.
It's a tough way to make a living.
A tough way to make a living, but also a difficult situation to maintain a base of operation and an economic base to be successful.
The Shelleys are essentially evicted off of their land that they had been there since the 1880s. Is that right?
Peter Shelley arrived on Mogollon Creek, on the banks of Mogollon Creek, in 1884 from Texas.
Okay, so
84. Prior to the time when the Gila was even a forest reserve. It was made a forest reserve in 1899. And then following those years, of course, the formation of the Forest Service occurred, and the progression and the evolution of that management continued after that. But they predated the Gila as a forest reserve. The 50s, particularly, was a time when the environmental movement, if you could even find the basic foundation of it, was largely latent. Was largely not active, and largely it was because of economics. I think the next period of time when you could see the development of the environmental movement in southwest New Mexico was late in the 60s and certainly early 70s. And I think that the biology department at Western New Mexico University had a great deal of influence on that. When there was a great disconnect between the older families in the livestock industry and the new concept of land management, and viewing land management and the stewardship of lands from a different perspective. I think there was a great deal of influence by certain professors there. And I think that continued to grow and expanded into other universities. And certainly other universities had a similar influence, albeit it wasn't necessarily the Gila that did it.
Did you see a change with Rachel Carson's work?
Rachel Carson certainly was around, and certainly we knew who she was.
Yeah.
But I don't think at that point in time that sort of thing had taken root and had grown, or had become part of the process. I think it was more of perhaps an innocent view of things. For example, the idea of eventually repopulating the Great Plains with buffalo, that was a great topic in a discussion. But those of us who went on and eventually had families and acquired mortgages and had to make payrolls and live life in reality, developed a different view of that. Even at that time, the roots of elitism were certainly showing. The continued artificial surroundings that group can trace its genesis from. The absence of economic or market forces to adjust or alter the thinking, and in fact the opposite, where thinking or research was unchallenged, in part because of the lack of interest on the part of those market forces, but in part the growth of universities and the emphasis of social issues rather than economical or industry type basic research pursuits. All of those things. The growth of government itself certainly had an influence on it. But there was no negative feedback to readjust and alter the course of thinking to make it more real world. You could become a god in your own right, and lots of people started to play God instead of simply taking care of their own business and those things that they could affect with their own influences or their own ability. The hypocrisy of the movement itself, if you stand back and look at it, the desire to, on one hand, subject the system to evolutionary pressures, and the other hand, attempt to modify or create a situation where, in all appearances, evolution has worked, but we don't believe the results. The wolf is a prime example. Yeah. Something's happened there, or the wolf itself would take hold. The coyote certainly did. And to continue to pour money into something where there is not going to be a success, at what point do we recognize that evolution is telling us something, and this won't work?
So we know that the coyotes have adapted extremely well. I mean, they're living in LA. They're living and eating pets and all that. They've discovered a wonderful food source. Now wolves, I think the environmentalists would say, well, no, the wolves were killed out by evil people using the, and they were decimated for that, but they in fact belong. But you don't think that's?
Do I think that that left unattended from this point forward will the wolves succeed? I do not. I think any objective thinker, if you had an opportunity to go to the Gila and experience the Gila on the basis of what Aldo Leopold envisioned for a wilderness adventure, would have to question why anybody would want to subject a poor wolf to those conditions. When you might ride for 3 or 4 days and see 15 or 20 deer, how is a wolf supposed to make a living under those conditions? Yeah. There's no wonder that you have pressure on livestock. Livestock aren't capable of reacting to a wolf's presence like an elk or like a deer. But I think every supporter of wolf reintroduction needs to see the fallacy and the horror that they are subjecting that animal to reintroduce it and to think that it can make its living and basically starve to death. I question the integrity of that idea. Let's recognize what has happened. Evolutionary pressures that include man, and man's part of this ecosystem now, have precluded the presence of wolf. The wolf continues to exist in a natural state in places in North America. Let's recognize that those areas continue to provide the basic framework for the wolf's existence. But in southern New Mexico, under these conditions, it has not been successful.
Supermarkets closed, huh?
Supermarkets closed. The Gila Watch and other organizations that grew out of that time period certainly became a political force. But at the same time, the ranching industry continued to diminish. to a point today where there's just a fraction of cattle numbers, or just a fraction of successful operations that exist. And I think ultimately we will have paid a price for that as well. Not only the loss of an industry, a component of the industry, but the stewardship aspects of what the presence and the occupation of that industry can provide. Water, infrastructure, water, nutritional supplements, those kind of things that deer and elk would both benefit from were largely non-existent. And there's no surprise about why and where deer populations are where they are.
Yeah, understood.
The presence of cattle, presence of water, presence of development, presence of salt and minerals and supplement. And the misconceived notion that if all ranchers were gone, that those conditions would actually be enhanced. That's a fallacy. And also this issue that we'll learn more about as time goes on, and it's the balance of an industry at equilibrium. And when you start messing with that balance, and when you start tweaking it and artificially and adjusting it, momentum is lost, participants and entry of new participants diminishes, and aging characteristics set in. The environmental movement has done that to many industries, and certainly the so-called extractive industries that once existed in the West. Livestock, mining, timber operations, and what a loss that has been, and ultimately what a shame that will be.